There are times in life when nothing seemingly extraordinary happens on the outside, but something deep begins to reorganize itself within you. There is no announcement, there are no witnesses, there is no specific moment that can be pointed out and said, "It was exactly here." And yet, something has changed. Maybe you've started to notice this quietly, not as an explosion, but as a subtle change in the way you look at the world. Things that once seemed urgent, now they seem far away. Environments that once seemed natural, now they look strange. And conversations that previously held his attention, now they seem empty. This does not happen by chance. Carl Jung said that there are moments in the soul's journey when the individual begins to move away from automatic life, the one that is guided only by external expectations, old habits, and inherited patterns. It is not a dramatic departure. It's almost invisible, but it is profound. And if you've made it to this video, there is a silent possibility that you may have already felt within yourself. Something in you has already begun to change. Not necessarily because you decided to change, but because something inside your own soul has begun to awaken. The empath, for a long time, lives outward-looking. He learns to feel the environment, to understand what others need, capturing emotions that often no one names. He adapts, it molds itself. He tries to maintain harmony, but there comes a moment, rare and almost always lonely, when this sensitivity begins to turn inward. And that's when something unexpected begins. Because the same consciousness that once felt the world begins to perceive itself. Suddenly, what once seemed normal starts to feel heavy. Certain emotional patterns no longer make sense. Certain relationships begin to reveal layers that were previously invisible. It is not a comfortable process, but it's not a mistake either. It is a sign that an old version of you is beginning to dissolve. Jung called this moment one of the first steps of individuation, the process by which a person stops living merely as a reflection of the world and slowly begins to become who he really is. But this transformation almost never begins with clarity. It starts with a feeling, a sense of distance, as if something inside you has taken a small step back. Just enough to observe life itself. Maybe you've felt it recently. Maybe you've started to notice that you don't react the same way anymore, that certain things have simply lost the power they had before, not because you became cold, but because something in you has begun to mature. And when this maturation begins, the empath enters a very particular phase of his journey. A phase in which he begins to realize that his sensitivity was not a mistake. It was a preparation. For a long time, the empath believed that his pain came only from the outside world, of disappointments, of broken expectations, of the relationships that did not know how to recognize their depth. But when consciousness begins to awaken, he notices something different. Pain wasn't just a burden. She was also a door. Every moment of silence, every feeling of displacement, every moment he felt different from the rest of the world was slowly preparing something inside him. A new way of existing, a quieter way, more aware, more whole. And that's why so many people come to feel strangely lonely during this process. Not because they are being abandoned, but because they are going through a transition. The old identity, the one that sought approval, that tried to belong at any cost, that carried expectations that were never really theirs, begins to lose strength. And in her place, something more authentic emerges, something rarer, something that no longer needs the constant validation of the world to exist. This is one of the most important moments in an empath's journey, because this is where liberation begins. Not a noisy release, not a dramatic break, but a silent release, a liberation that happens within. The mind begins to become clearer. Thoughts that once seemed confused begin to organize, and the person begins to realize that maybe, just maybe, he has never been lost. Maybe he was just going through a process. Carl Jung believed that each individual carries within him a kind of invisible map, a path that cannot be fully explained, only lived. And when a person begins to perceive this inner calling, something curious happens. She stops trying to control everything. She begins to trust that there is a meaning in what is happening inside her, trusting that the silence that sometimes feels like isolation, it can be, in fact, a space for reconstruction. Trusting that the old version of yourself is being left behind for a reason, because something new is being born, something more aligned with one's own soul. And maybe that's exactly why you're here now. Perhaps this video appeared to you at a very specific time, a moment when you have already begun to realize that you are no longer exactly the same person you were before. Not completely, not in the same way. Something has changed. Perhaps it is not yet easy to explain, but you feel it. And when this sensation appears, it usually brings two things at the same time: a slight strangeness and an unexpected sense of peace. As if, for the first time in a long time, you are beginning to get closer to who you really are. Not the version the world expected, but from the version that your own soul always knew you could become. And when this process begins, there is no turning back. Because once consciousness awakens, it never goes back to sleep in the same way. In the next few moments of this video, we're going to explore something that few really understand: the silent transformation that happens when the empath begins to leave behind his old identity and enters a rare phase of inner liberation. A phase in which the pain begins to lose the control it had and a new form of existence begins to emerge. A freer way, more aware, and deeply connected with what Carl Jung called the true path of the soul. The silent moment. When the empath realizes he can't go back to who he was, there is a moment in the life of an empath that almost no one around notices. It doesn't happen on a specific day. It is not an event that can be pointed out. There is no conversation that marks the beginning of this change. It's something quieter than that, something internal. For a long time, the empath has been trying to maintain a kind of invisible balance with the world. He feels people, perceives tensions, understands emotions that are often not even spoken in words. He tries to harmonize everything, try to avoid conflicts, try to keep relationships going. He tries to be understanding even when no one seems to understand him. On the outside, it often looks like he's just living like anyone else. But inside, there is a constant effort, an effort that is almost never recognized. Over time, this way of living begins to create a feeling that is difficult to explain. It's not exactly sadness, it's not exactly tiredness either. It is something deeper, a sense that something inside him is constantly being ignored. And for a long time, the empath does not perceive this clearly. He believes he just needs to adapt a little more, understand a little more, be patient a little longer. But there is a point in the journey when something starts to change. It is not a revolt. It is not a dramatic decision. It's a perception, a silent realization that he can no longer continue living in the same way. Suddenly, certain situations start to look different. Certain conversations no longer have the same meaning. Certain environments start to generate a strange discomfort, not because something external has changed, but because something inside began to awaken. Carl Jung often spoke of this moment as an invisible point in the process of individuation, an instant when consciousness begins to move away from the old way of existing. The person is still in the same place, but he is no longer living in the same way. The empath begins to realize that he has spent years trying to fit into spaces that were never really made for him. He begins to realize that many choices did not come from his own essence, but from an attempt to keep the peace around. And when this realization arises, something very important happens. He begins to observe his own life from the outside, not with judgment, but clearly. He notices patterns that once seemed normal. He notices behaviors that he used to repeat automatically. He realizes how he often put the energy of the whole world ahead of his own. And this clarity creates a curious effect. It does not immediately bring answers, but it brings something even more powerful. It brings awareness. And when consciousness appears, the old way of living begins to lose strength. What once seemed inevitable is starting to seem optional. What once seemed obligatory is starting to seem strange. The empath begins to feel that there is a growing distance between who he was and who he is beginning to become. This distance can lead to confusion at first, because the old identity is still present, but something new has already begun to be born. It is as if two versions of the same person began to coexist for a while. The old version, who learned to survive by adapting to the world, and the new version, who begins to realize that their life can no longer be built only around external expectations. This is one of the most delicate moments of the empath's journey, because nothing seems to be completely changed, but at the same time, everything has already started to change. He's still in the same places, he still talks to the same people, he still lives within the same routine. But something inside him has already crossed an invisible boundary. And once that boundary is crossed, there is no complete return, because consciousness cannot forget what it has already seen. And it is at this point that the empath begins to understand something profound about himself. Your sensitivity has never been a weakness. It was, in fact, a form of perception, a way of perceiving the invisible layers of reality. For a long time, this perception was used only to understand others. Now it begins to be used to understand oneself. And when that happens, a new journey begins. A lonelier journey, but also a truer one. A journey in which the empath begins to approach what Jung called the true center of being, an internal place where identity is not built by the need to please, but by the need to be. And when the drawer reaches that point, he begins to perceive something quiet but profound. He can no longer go back to who he was, not because he rejects his past, but because something inside him has already awakened, and once that awakening begins, the soul never again accepts to live sleeping in the same way. When the rare soul begins to withdraw from the world it used to call normal. After this silent change begins, something curious starts to happen in the empath's life. The world around you remains exactly the same. People continue to live their routines. The conversations continue to take place. The same habits continue to be repeated every day. But the way the empath perceives all this begins to change. Things that once seemed natural now generate a strange sensation. It is not rejection. It is not contempt. It's just a different perception. He begins to notice how many behaviors are automatically repeated, how many conversations go around in circles, as many relationships exist more out of habit than truth. And this creates a feeling that is difficult to explain, a sense of displacement. The empath begins to feel that they are somehow living at a different pace from the environment around them. It's as if your perception has expanded a little more. And when this expansion happens, certain things stop making sense. What once seemed urgent is beginning to look superficial. What once seemed important is starting to feel empty. This change does not happen aggressively. It happens slowly, quietly. The empath begins to spend more time in silence. He begins to observe more than he speaks. He begins to feel less of a need to explain who he is. Often people around do not understand this process. They may interpret this change as distance, but in fact, something very different is happening. The empath is not moving away from people, he's drawing closer to himself, and this process almost always involves a period of solitude. Not a painful loneliness, but a necessary solitude. Carl Jung believed that every profound process of transformation requires a period of inner withdrawal, a moment when the person needs to get away from the noise of the world to hear something more subtle, something that cannot be heard in the midst of the rush, something that only appears in silence. During this time, the empath begins to rediscover parts of themselves that have been hidden for years, parts that have been muted to maintain harmony, parts that were ignored to avoid conflicts, parts that never had space to fully exist. And when those parts start to emerge, a new sensation appears, a sense of authenticity. The empath begins to realize that he no longer needs to mold himself so much. You no longer need to adjust every word. You no longer have to carry the emotional weight of everyone around you. This perception does not emerge as a decision. It arises as a natural liberation, as if something inside him silently said, "Now you can be who you really are." This is one of the rarest phases of the inner journey, because many people spend their entire lives trying to fit into external expectations. Few have the courage or the awareness to go through the process of becoming authentic. But when the empath enters this path, something inside him begins to align. He begins to feel a peace that no longer depends so much on external circumstances, a peace that is born of internal coherence. He begins to realize that he no longer needs to chase belonging, because something inside him has already begun to find a place. That place is not in the outside world, he's in. And when that meeting happens, the empath perceives something that completely changes his way of existing. He no longer needs to fit in, it just needs to be. And it is at this moment that the transformation journey deepens even more, because when the soul begins to move away from the old illusions of the world, it begins to get closer to its true essence, the encounter with the shadow, the inner truth that initiates transformation. After the empath begins to quietly move away from the old ways of living, a new kind of encounter begins to take place within him. It is not an encounter with the world, it is an encounter with oneself. For a long time, the empath lives facing outwards. Their attention is on the emotions of others, on the needs of environments, on the invisible tensions that arise between people. He develops such a great sensitivity that he often becomes an expert in perceiving everything, except for himself, not because of incapacity, but because its energy has always been directed outwards. When this movement begins to change, something very profound happens. The empath starts to look inward, and it is at this moment that he finds something that Jung called the shadow. Shadow is not something negative, as many people imagine. It is not a dark place that needs to be avoided. It is, in fact, the set of parts of our own soul that have been left behind throughout life, parts that have not had space to exist, parts that have been silenced, parts that were hidden so that the person could continue to belong to the world. In the case of the empath, many of these parts have to do with their own strength. For a long time, he learned to be understanding, patient, and welcoming. He learned to soften tensions. He learned to be someone who keeps the balance around. But in this process, something very important was often hidden. Your own individuality, its own intensity, your own inner truth. When the empath begins to find his shadow, he begins to realize that it wasn't just sensitivity that existed within him. There was also strength. There was also a will. There was also an identity that for a long time remained silent. This encounter can be uncomfortable at first, not because the shadow is dangerous, but because it reveals things that were previously invisible. It shows patterns that have been repeated for years. It shows decisions that were made just to maintain harmony. It shows how many times the empath has put the well-being of others ahead of his own. This perception can bring a sense of surprise, but it also brings something extremely liberating: clarity. The empath begins to understand that many of the pains he experienced were not only caused by the outside world, they were also born from the way he related to himself. For a long time, he denied important parts of his own essence, parts that are now starting to ask for space. And when those parts start to emerge, something inside of it starts to reorganize. He begins to realize that his sensitivity no longer needs to be just a form of adaptation. It can become a form of consciousness, a form of presence, a way of living with more truth. Carl Jung believed that the integration of the shadow is one of the most important moments of the inner journey, because it is at this point that the person stops fighting against parts of themselves and begins to accept them as part of the totality of your being. The empath begins to realize that they no longer need to divide their identity between what is acceptable and what needs to be hidden. He begins to realize that his soul is broader than he imagined, more complex, more true. And this acceptance creates a profound transformation, because when someone accepts their own shadow, something curious happens. The internal struggle begins to disappear. Energy that was once used to hide certain parts of yourself is now used to live more authentically. This change does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, but every little acceptance creates a new level of freedom. The empath begins to feel that they no longer need to maintain a constant image. It no longer has to be just the understanding person. You no longer have to carry the weight of balancing everything around. It can simply exist, with all your layers, with all its depth, with all his humanity. And when this integration begins, something very important happens. The old identity begins to lose its strength, because it was built on the denial of important parts of one's soul. Now, a new identity begins to emerge, a more complete identity, more whole, more true. And it is at this moment that the empath begins to go through one of the deepest points of his journey, the point at which he stops running away from his own truth, and he begins to walk towards her. This is the real beginning of the transformation, a transformation that does not only happen in behavior, but in the very way of existing. And when this transformation begins, it can no longer be interrupted. Inner liberation. When the empath stops carrying the weight that was never yours. Once the empath finds his shadow and begins to recognize parts of himself that were hidden, something very important begins to happen within him. A process of liberation. But this liberation does not happen in a noisy way. There is no such thing as a moment of dramatic rupture. There is no explosive decision. It happens silently, gradually. The empath begins to notice something that previously seemed impossible to see. Much of the weight he carried, it was never really yours. For a long time, his sensitivity made him feel everything around. He sensed emotional tensions. I felt the suffering of the people. I absorbed charged environments without even realizing it. This ability to perceive is something rare. But when there is no consciousness, it can cause the empath to begin to live as if he were responsible for everything that happens around him. Responsible for people's emotions, responsible for the harmony of environments, responsible for maintaining balance in relationships. This kind of invisible responsibility creates a huge weight, a weight that does not appear externally, but it consumes internal energy constantly. For years, the empath often lives like this without realizing it. He believes he is just being sensitive. He believes that he is just being careful. He believes that he is only doing what is right. But when your consciousness begins to awaken, something changes. He begins to realize that he cannot carry the whole world within him. He begins to realize that each person has their own journey, your own pain, your own growth process. This perception is not born of indifference, it is born of maturity. The empath begins to understand that feeling the world does not mean having to save it. Feeling does not mean absorbing. To perceive does not mean to carry. This difference changes everything. Because when the empath understands this deeply, an enormous amount of energy begins to unleash within him. The energy that was once being used to sustain unseen conflicts begins to return to its own center. He starts to feel lighter, not because the world has gotten easier, but because he stopped taking on responsibilities that were never really his. This moment is extremely important in the inner journey, because this is where the empath begins to recover something that has often been lost along the way: your very presence. He begins to realize that he can exist in the world without dissolving into it. You can feel people without losing yourself. You can be present without carrying the emotional weight of everything around you. This change creates a new form of balance, an internal balance. Carl Jung believed that true psychological maturity happens when a person begins to become responsible only for what really belongs to his own soul, not less, not anymore. When the empath reaches this point, he begins to feel something that he may not have experienced for a long time. Tranquility, not a superficial tranquility, but a deep tranquility. A feeling that his energy has finally returned home. He begins to realize that he no longer needs to wear himself out, trying to correct everything around him. You no longer have to exhaust yourself trying to keep everyone's balance. Now he can just live, with awareness, with presence, with truth. And when this liberation happens, the empath begins to feel something even deeper, a new type of relationship with oneself, a relationship based on inner respect. He begins to realize that his own life also deserves care, that your own energy also deserves protection, that your own soul also deserves attention. This recognition creates a new kind of strength, a silent force, a force that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, a force that simply exists. And it is at this moment that the empath begins to go through one of the most important transitions of his journey. He ceases to live only to sustain the world around him, and you begin, finally, to live in alignment with your own essence. That is true liberation, not an escape from the world, but a deep reconnection with what has always been inside him. And when this reconnection happens, a new phase of life begins to emerge, a phase in which the empath begins for the first time to learn something that he may never have learned before: to love yourself. The birth of self-love, the day the empath chooses himself, after the empath begins to free himself from the weight that was never really his, something new begins to emerge within him. At first, it is almost imperceptible. It's not an intense emotion, it's not a dramatic feeling, it's something quieter, a change in the way he starts to relate to himself. For a long time, the empath lived with his attention turned outward. His gaze was always on the needs of the people, on the feelings of the environment, on the invisible tensions that arose around him. He learned to care, he learned to understand, he learned to welcome, but he rarely learned anything essential: learning to welcome yourself. This absence of inner care did not happen because he did not deserve this care. It often happened because he never had the space to realize his own need for love. His energy was always being directed toward others. When inner liberation begins, something important changes. The energy that was once constantly directed outward begins to return. And when this energy returns, the empath begins to perceive something that he may never have felt so clearly. It also deserves to exist fully. He also deserves peace. He also deserves to be treated with the same sensitivity he has always offered to the world. This perception may seem simple, but for the empath, it represents a profound change. Because for a long time, he believed that loving others was his main mission. Now he begins to realize that loving himself is also part of this journey. This self-love does not come as a conscious decision. It is born as a natural consequence of consciousness. The empath begins to perceive his own limits more clearly. You begin to notice when your energy needs rest. You begin to notice when something no longer resonates with your inner truth. And for the first time in a long time, he is beginning to respect those perceptions. This inner respect creates something that may have been lacking for years, a space of peace within oneself. The empath begins to realize that he no longer needs to prove himself to the world. He no longer needs to justify his sensitivity. You no longer need to explain why certain things touch your soul so deeply. He begins to accept his own nature. And when this acceptance happens, something very beautiful begins to blossom within him, a sense of inner dignity. He begins to realize that his journey was not a mistake. Every moment of pain, every displacement sensation, every moment he felt different from the rest of the world. All of this was shaping something inside him, something stronger, something more conscious, something more true. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation often brings a person to a point where he finally begins to recognize the value of his own soul. Not value based on external achievements, but value based simply on existence. When the empath reaches this point, he begins to feel a new relationship with life, a calmer relationship, deeper, more honest. He begins to realize that he no longer needs to run after validation because something inside him has already begun to recognize itself. This change creates a new kind of emotional stability. Not a rigid stability, but a living stability, a sense of being rooted in oneself. And when one starts living from that inner place, something very interesting happens. The world is no longer a place where a person constantly needs to prove his worth. It becomes just a space where the person can express who they really are. The empath begins to feel that his sensitivity no longer needs to be a form of survival. It can become a form of presence, a way to perceive the beauty of the world without getting lost inside it. This is the birth of self-love, not a love based on pride, but a love based on recognition. The recognition that your soul deserves to exist with truth, and when that love starts to grow, something even deeper begins to emerge, a new identity. An identity that no longer depends on the old versions of itself, a freer identity, quieter, rarest. And it is at this point that the empath begins to go through the last stage of this transformation, a step that few really understand, the silent ascension of the soul, the silent rise, the new identity of the empath that few in the world understand. After the empath goes through the process of inner liberation and begins to develop a true relationship with themselves, something very special begins to happen. He enters a different phase of his journey, a phase that is rarely recognized by the outside world. Because it is not visible, it does not appear in external achievements, it does not appear in dramatic changes, it happens within. Carl Jung believed that throughout life, there are moments when a person stops living only guided by the conditionings of the world and begins to live from his own inner center. When that moment comes, something deep reorganizes itself within the soul. The person stops automatically reacting to external expectations. It begins to act from its own essence. In the case of the empath, this transition creates a very particular change. For a long time, he lived absorbing the world. Now he begins to observe it with a new clarity. He still feels deeply, but it is no longer lost within the external emotions. He still notices people, but you no longer need to carry your stories. This new way of existing creates a sense of quiet stability, a stability that does not depend on external circumstances. The empath begins to realize that there is a huge difference between being present in the world and dissolving into it. And this realization creates a new kind of freedom. He can walk among people without having to mold himself to each environment. You can listen without absorbing. You can feel it without getting lost. This is one of the deepest forms of emotional maturity, but the world rarely understands this transformation because it is not noisy. It's not dramatic. It's not something that can be displayed. Often the person who has undergone this transformation just seems calmer, quieter, more observant. But inside, something much bigger happened. The old identity ceased to exist. The version of the person who lived trying to live up to external expectations no longer defines his life. In its place, something more authentic emerged, an identity aligned with one's own soul. This new identity has a very particular characteristic. It doesn't need constant recognition. It does not need approval. It simply exists. Carl Jung described this moment as a point at which the individual begins to live in contact with the self, the deepest center of the psyche, not as an abstract idea, but as a living experience. The person feels that their life has begun to align with something greater than the old patterns. She feels like she's finally found inner direction, and when this happens, something curious appears. A sense of peace, not a superficial peace, but a quiet peace, a peace that is born from the fact that the person has finally stopped fighting against himself. The empath who goes through this process begins to realize that their journey was never about fitting in. It was never about matching the world perfectly. She was always about becoming who she really was. And when that perception becomes clear, something inside him stabilizes. He no longer needs to chase belonging, because something inside him has already found a place. This place is not a physical space. It is a state of consciousness, a state in which the person finally feels that he can exist with truth. No masks, no constant effort to adapt, just being. This is the point at which the empath becomes something rare in the modern world, a person who lives sensitively, but also with awareness, with depth, but also with balance, with presence, but also with inner freedom. This is the silent ascension of the soul, a transformation that does not need to be announced, but that completely changes the way a person lives. And maybe that's exactly what you've started to feel inside yourself. Perhaps something in you has already crossed that invisible boundary. Maybe you've already realized that you're no longer exactly the same person you were before. And if that happened, so your journey has already begun. A silent journey, but profoundly true, the journey of becoming who your soul always knew you could be.